shoppers haunting those silent lacquered halls. The island's main harvest was parking lots. They grew thick around the off-ramps, thick as the trees that guided the highway and gave riders a sense of the wilderness that must once have covered the island from shoulder to foot. Still, even today, it is not entirely tame. We passed Wall Street traders in Budweiser red Porsches and swerving out-of-state minivans, and I felt the heavy bass of radios in my teeth. We wove so quickly along those 4 eastbound lanes, opting mostly for the HOV, that I didn't bother to tell Paul how hungry I was, and every turnoff blurred by us as an afterthought. As the signs reading "Attractions" grew sparser and emptier, the sunlight picked through the dense Atlantic clouds, and, for a few minutes on those last speeding turns, we glowed. We took the Long Island Expressway to its last exits, and while most of the cars threaded south at the splitting, off to the Hamptons, we went north, to Orient. Paul had taken me out of the city to save me. Those were his words. And I'll admit, I needed saving. I had hitchhiked all the way from California locked in cars with strangers, but now in Paul's Mercedes, I was anxious. His knuckles skimmed my knee as he maneuvered the stick, and I kept a lookout for train stations in case my nerves got the better of me. On a thin, red artery of a country road, the last footprints of city life disappeared. Tiny private gas stations were already shuttered for the off-season. Apple orchards and vineyards blanketed the fields. Between them, blue pines rolled their coats in the wind. I counted telephone poles. Later, they would be decorated with my picture, and worried how many more there would be, leading us through vacant farmland. Paul licked his lips and smiled. "Peaceful, isn't it?" he said. I put my fingers on the door handle and looked back at the road, one long, black carpet to New York being yanked from under our wheels, and for the first time I could remember, I was frightened to be traveling east. I had lived in Manhattan for 5 months, first on the couches of friends I had known back west, then on the floors of acquaintances whose bad habits began at midnight and who threw blankets over their windows at the first tremors of dawn. I can still remember the panic on those mornings when the muscular lights of the city bleached into the mineral blue of the sky, and all the promises I had told myself at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock a.m. tasted bitter and stale in my throat. On the day Paul finally intervened, I was barely forming sentences, slumped in the hallway of his Chinatown apartment building. He lived next door to an acquaintance of mine, and we had exchanged small talk several times in the foyer of his building. I was new enough to New York to include a bit of recent history with my hellos, and Paul was old enough in New York to understand why a kid wearing the same dirty t-shirt would come banging on his neighbor's door so often. On that day, when Paul practically stumbled over me on his 3rd-floor landing, he hardly recognized the grime-streaked teenager crouching like a gargoyle at his door. He let me into his apartment, poured me lemony water, and offered me his phone, though I waved it off. "I'm not really like this," I kept repeating, but for a while I refused to say what I was like. Paul turned his sofa into a sickbed, and I stayed there until I shook out my shakes and my constant sweat soaked his cushions. I made sure to fall asleep before he could find subtle excuses to kick me out. In the morning, I showered, washed his dishes, and scoured the top of his stove. "You didn't have to," he said, squinting in disbelief to find both me and his apartment cleaner than he'd left us. "Yeah, I did. I'm good at helping." That's when I told Paul what I was like. Mixed up in drugs. At bad ends, for sure, but someone who could straighten out if he managed to find his footing. Someone, I told him, who could be all right. After a long talk, he suggested that I get some distance from the city and come with him to help fix up his weekend house. I repeat, it was not my idea to come this far east, but east sounded right, and I agreed. Orient. It still sounds beautiful, or would if I didn't know any better. We gutted through the low mud pastures. Roadkill bloodied the